Welcome to the virtual panel discussion, Rethinking Placemaking, presented by the Real Estate and Development Club of the Graduate School of Design, the Real Estate Club of Harvard Business School, and the Harvard Real Estate Review. My name is Grace, and I'm a co-director of the panel, together with Joe.
Hi, everyone.
And we're both students at the GSD. To put the event into context, this panel was originally part of the Harvard Real Estate Weekend that had been scheduled for last month, but was unfortunately canceled due to the coronavirus outbreak. Joy and I had been so excited about bringing together this amazing group of panelists, so we decided to move the conversation online instead, which had the additional benefit of opening up the discussion to a larger audience. Placemaking is becoming a powerful engine of value creation in the real estate industry. Value that is not just limited to the monetary and that benefits more than just the traditional players of developers and investors. In other words, we shouldn't merely see placemaking as a strategy for higher premiums and product differentiation, nor should we see it as social responsibility that will cut into the bottom line. Instead, it can be thought of more sustainably as the creation of shared value through the practice of placemaking.
While placemaking is becoming a buzzword, more questions arise. How can we capture the shared value created through placemaking and at what cost? What are the conflicts and trade-offs? What makes for a good or a bad placemaking project? Is placemaking becoming merely a prescriptive move? And what constitutes authentic and genuine placemaking? Last but not least, in the current context of COVID-19 pandemic, what does placemaking mean from the perspective of public health? This panel will address these questions through the lens of art, design, urban planning, data, economic development, investment, and more. Now I'll hand it over to our wonderful moderator, Mr. Michael Basorti.
All right, thank you, Joe and Grace, and thank you to the Real Estate Club of Harvard Business School and Real Estate Club of Harvard Graduate School of Design. Yeah, so I'm going to introduce just our panelists, and they're going to speak in a moment. Well, first off, I'm Michael Basorti. I'm the founder of Tungsten Partners. We're a holdings company, but we engage in placemaking as a regular practice in a number of cities. Warren Hagist is the assistant vice president at NYCEDC. Aaron Jodka is the managing director of client services in Boston and the regional research ambassador for the Northeast at Colliers. Dishi Wang is a consultant at Alvarez and Marshall, and yet behind is a visual artist. So hopefully you could all see them there. So before I introduce them, and they'll speak a little bit about themselves to introduce themselves, I also want to say a little bit something about COVID-19. So yeah, I went up there to Boston for the panel, and then it was canceled pretty much right when I arrived. And I'm so thankful to Joe and Grace and others for putting this together, and hopefully this will work out. I mean, we've certainly never done this before. Hopefully there won't be a errant dog running through someone's screen or something will fall, but you know, bear with us, and we appreciate your patience. Placemaking is sort of by definition in many ways an economic endeavor. It deals with real estate, that's in the title. And it seems in some ways that, you know, in light of what's going on right now, you know, is that something we want to talk about? And I think it is. And but we want to be very sensitive to what's going on right now. It's really a very tough time for so many people. And as we were reflecting on this talk, I looked through some of the things that Tungsten was blessed enough to be involved with, producing or co-producing in the realm of placemaking. And it occurred to me how much of that and what was made special from those things came from independent proprietors, restaurateurs, coffee roasters, artists, programming partners, designers, and so many of them are and may be struggling right now. So, you know, they're in our hearts, and all of this is definitely with them in mind. But also we're here to share our own ideas, promote each other's ideas, and maybe learn a little bit. And at some point we'll probably talk about how placemaking will be affected and is affected in the immediate and potentially long term. So without further ado, I want to introduce the panelists so they can just sort of speak for a moment, maybe present for a little bit, and then they'll get into further discussion later. Maybe we'll start with Warren. Hey, Warren.
Hi, thanks so much. And thanks again to Joe and Grace for putting this on. We were all real disappointed when it was canceled, and really admire you putting this on despite everything. Nice to have some normalcy. So I'm a proud graduate school design graduate, both in urban planning with a real estate concentration. And I work at the New York City Economic Development Corporation, which you can think of sort of as the city's real estate development arm. Where I get to put together urban planning and real estate on a daily basis. Actually, a lot of my work resembles a lot of the sort of maybe interdisciplinary projects that you would have during class. If you think about it, the city is actually the largest property owner in the city. If you think about all the roads, parks, firehouses, police stations, schools that we have, those are all being operated to carry out the many social services the city performs. And like any good portfolio manager, from time to time, we look at our assets and think how we can reposition them and maybe redevelop them for something that's a higher and better use, maybe that affordable housing, maybe new park space, maybe new sort of commercial opportunities in the neighborhood. And so when we do our redevelopment of assets, that's when we think, what is the placemaking goal that we have for this neighborhood, for the city at large, and for this property? So I think that's it for me for the introduction. I'll be happy to go into some of the concrete projects later on.
No, that's great. Thanks a lot, Warren. Aaron, do you want to give an introduction, please?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. Thank you. And as everyone was saying, thank you for putting this all together. Appreciate it. I'm Aaron Jodka. I'm the Managing Director of Research and Client Services at Colliers in Boston. So my background is studying cities and economies and understanding what happens within them. And part of this stuff that we'll talk about today will be how you can use data and what data and valuation components there can be around placemaking. And it's such a popular tool today in the developer's toolkit. So really looking forward to chatting about that. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Colliers, we are a full service commercial services firm. So we represent landlords, tenants, buyers, sellers. We can put debt and equity, really anything with real estate we can help with. My background's in research, studied economics, so really focused on the commercial real estate aspect of economics.
Thank you, Aaron. So next is Dishi Wang. Go ahead, Dishi.
Hey, good morning, everyone. This is Dishi Wang. Great to join everybody, and thank you, Joe and Grace, to invite us to be part of it. So my background is in urban planning, landscape architecture. Right now I work at Alvarez & Marcel. It's a consulting company that we provide real estate transaction advisory services for institutions and public sectors. We support with initial entitlement process, transaction, all the way through the development. So my background prior to this was in urban planning. So I focused a few years in urban planning world and the design and construction world, so heavily involved in institutions, university campuses, and city planning. So happy to be here and share some of on the urban planning design aspect.
And I'm going to briefly introduce Yepa because he's actually has a much longer presentation later, but I kind of want to give a special thanks to Yepa Hein, who's a visual artist, but who is, his work is so important to so many places and so many cities all around the world. And he was actually gracious enough to come on and speak with us only after yesterday being invited. So it's been a bit of a scramble and we're super psyched to have him. So hi, Yepa, and you could say hello, but you'll have a lot of time to talk later. Thanks, Yepa. Yeah, so I think I'm going to try to speak less about tungsten during this talk, and other people have presentations, but I do think I'm supposed to go and introduce myself. So I wanted to see if I could take over and just show a little bit about us in context. A little introduction on tungsten. We are a holdings company. We do a number of different things, but here we're talking about placemaking, and we've been doing that for at least a decade. A lot of it related to ACE. We put a quote, ACE Hotels, which is a hotel company you may know about. We were the longest standing owner there for about 10 years. Until my partner passed away, Alex Calderwood. Here you have a quote about ACE being a hot neighborhood starter kit. was referencing New York. And then when Tungsten did some of the work also in LA, it referenced Tungsten as a starter kit's invisible hand. This is a little bit of our structure. Tungsten owns a real estate company which complements the work that we do in placemaking, also an art publication called Art Observed, and about stakes in about 30 different creative companies on the right. And all of those kind of come together to inform our placemaking. Those are minority stakes, but they're in hospitality, fashion, consumer products, coffee, tea. That's the Ace Hotel lobby, which I think was very definitive for that neighborhood. That is the Ace Hotel Palm Springs, another awesome project, which I think really helped to kind of galvanize activity within the city of Palm Springs. That's the Ace LA, which is a very important deal to Tungsten, really near and dear to our hearts. It has an amazing theater. And it's a beautiful building in downtown LA, but we also brought in the restaurant, and Tungsten also brought in a number of different collaborators around that neighborhood that was previously not as activated, such as Acne Studios, APC, Aesop, Tanner Goods, Maikita, Big Yay Ice Cream, Oak, about 9 different collaborators and retailers around, which kind of helped to create that neighborhood, and I think made an interesting impact on that neighborhood. That's the Ace Hotel London, which I think is a very important part of Shoreditch that came from actually an ex-boss of mine at Starwood Capital, who is our owner. And then that's a little bit from the Ace Hotel London. That's another deal that we really love. That's in Panama, which is actually in the Casco Viejo, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's called the American Trade Hotel. It was also managed by Ace that Tungsten worked on. And that's Ace Hotel New Orleans. That's Frida. Susanna is the owner. She comes from Marfa, Texas. We'll talk about that later, but that's one of the stores, the Ace Hotel New Orleans. Now moving on to some of the placemaking engagements in cities. So Hudson Square was our first one. Basically after Alex passed away and we sold our equity in Ace, we were trying to figure out our next moves. We're working on some of our own hotel projects, which you'll hear about a little bit. But some of our friends and owners and people who were part of larger real estate companies came to us and said, could you do some of the stuff you did for Ace for us? And so Hudson Square was one of the first one. It is an amazing and dynamic neighborhood. It's owned by a partnership between Hines, Norgis, and Trinity Church. It's about 6 million square feet, and we did a lot of creative activities such as art procurement and pop-ups, but also a lot of tenanting. And then that's Gitano, which is a 22,000 foot piece of land, which we put a pop-up from Tulum. That's a picture of it. Moving quickly, that's Sawyer Yards, which is an arts district in Houston with about 66 acres that we worked on some advisory there. And that's Ossington in Toronto, which is I think one of the more interesting and neighborhoods in Toronto, which we were brought on by Hallmark, which is a great real estate firm out of Toronto. And then this is 601 Lexington, a property we worked on. We were brought in to help to advise on creative direction for the base. It's 4.5 million square feet that Boston Properties owns on those corners. They're the largest Class A office owner, I believe, in the country. And then finally, this is the Goat Farm, which is a project Tungsten's working on as our own hotel, 12 acres, old buildings, but now it's an art campus. It's where they filmed the Hunger Games. I think that's out of sequence, but this is Pier 70. It's a deal that we're working on with Brookfield, which is also an amazing project. It's 3.5 million square feet roughly, right on the waterfront in San Francisco. It's going to be an amazing addition to San Francisco. There's some pictures there, almost done. And this is 5M, a brand new project we have that Tungsten's advising on. And also we have the exclusive for the real estate in these projects. And this is going to be a fantastic project right in the middle of San Francisco. And it's so much involving bringing the community to be a part of it. And Brookfield's done so much with that. And we're there to help and sort of help bring that to life with them. This is a project we have, a hotel and that we're working on. I'm not showing it, but in Austin, this is a project we have upstate that we're working on. That's it for me. I'm going to bounce out. So I'm going to move on to the panelists. And all right, so Dishi, if you can unmute you have a background in landscape design, urban planning. You've worked in cities all over the world. You and I spoke and you highlighted that you have specialized over the years in repositioning underutilized properties. And so much of what I've seen in your work involves public space, things that are given to the community and help to activate the community. So I thought you might be best to answer the question of what is placemaking, if it can be described. So I'll pass it off to you, and then others you can jump in, and then I'll let you know when we can go to the next question.
Sure, yeah. So every time we start a development process, we often ask ourselves these questions. What are we creating? We're creating a market, a place for events or festivals, or simply just a retail experience. So these are all the questions that we always kept in mind before even starting the process. So ultimately, just kind of like the word itself, placemaking, making a place, and is truly creating experience and connecting people, the interaction. But it's a challenging now. We're thinking a few weeks ago that we were all gathering at all these event places, and now it's we're social distancing. Well, placemaking about social interaction. But in a way, it gave us opportunity to really rethink the place, and I see that there's a lot of opportunity for us to both now and future really to think how we use this place, how people's utilization during the day, the season of the place, and as well as even some thought on the materials, how we could think about the sustainability or in terms of contributing to public health. When some major events like these happens, and how we can respond quickly to respond to the need. So this is what we evaluate some of the placemaking thinking.
Okay. So does anyone else want to supplement Aaron or Warren the definition of placemaking in your minds?
Sure, I'll chime in. To me, placemaking is individual, and what placemaking is to one person and what it is to one group or developer is different to another. It's an experience in a lot of ways. And when we're talking to developers, when we're talking to our clients, the tenants that are occupying these spaces, it has to grow organically. And we have to have a natural mix of companies, of industries, of different property uses. It's not a stamp. It's not just something here. I put these 4 things together, magically it's a place. The community needs to determine whether or not it's truly a place, and if it is driving a need to attend and go there and experience whatever that location is.
I completely agree with what Aaron says. The age of master planning, when it was 1 or 2 or a small group of people putting their vision for a neighborhood onto a city, that era sort of failed. And so we try to engage in as bottom up or grassroots planning as we possibly can. I think Dishi said, before you really can start building, you have to do a lot of talking to the community, figuring out what is the place that you're actually trying to make. And to Aaron's point, that has to be sort of organically grown. Now, obviously, there are certain fiscal and regulatory constraints. We can't just build anything. And so what we try to do then is build a scaffold, an outline of uses that we know that the community is asking for, but something that's not overly prescriptive, so that the identity of the place can fill in over time.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I mean, Aaron, I think the word organic is very apt. And Warren, I think you're absolutely right. In our projects, especially the larger neighborhood ones, I think identifying the stakeholders, not just as the developer, but also as the community and the city as a whole, I think is very important. For Tungsten, we never really got into placemaking by design. We kind of sort of fell into it, but I sort of look at it slightly in another way too, which is for us, and a lot of also drew from our practice with ACE, and we were traveling around the world. For every deal that we did, there were maybe like 3 or 4 or maybe more that we didn't do. And if we were in a different city, like working with a chaebol in Korea or something, it was about trying to identify what that place was and working with collaborators, which could be from that city or from another city, to sort of interpret that place. And the building or groupings of buildings should be in strong dialogue with the adjacent architecture, its own architecture, and the feeling of that neighborhood. And sometimes dialogue doesn't mean immediately reflective of it or copying it. It could be something new. And so what we thought about, I guess when we describe placemaking, is in a way, in the word root, it's making something more of it a place, or more of its own place, which I think is deriving some of its own identity and enhancing it through collaboration and through art, programming, community involvement, and the involvement of kind of independent players, either tenants or program partners, who will reflect that narrative and then create a more evolving and hopefully magnetic place. That's some of how we see it. So I'll move over to Warren. So Warren, first off, we're super psyched to have you on the panel, and we've been at Tungsten, a little bit involved with NYCEDC for quite some time, and we're so impressed with all the things, of course, that you guys are doing over there. But I think you're significant to the panel in that you represent the merging of public and private, and the partnerships that you put together are aligning those interests and very much related to the stakeholders in the community. So I'm wondering, how do sort of more noble and grander sort of pursuits beyond economics reflect in your placemaking activity, meaning social good, kind of pushing things forward, evolving ideas within the city and the community? How are those things reflected, and what practices do you put forward to implement sort of a higher vision in the long term for the community within the work that you do?
Yeah, thanks for that question. We have a double bottom line model at the EDC. And so we are very explicit in trying to solve for not just a financially sustainable project, but also one that is socially sustainable. And when I say socially sustainable, it's defined in sort of two ways. There's the local sort of stakeholder group in the community that's surrounding the property, which will be redeveloped, and who's going to live adjacent to it and maybe work with it. But then there's also the broader city goals, the city policy goals. For example, the mayor has an affordable housing initiative, a certain target number of units that are affordable at a certain AMI, area median income, that he would like to produce over the next 10 years. There's different sort of economic development goals, different industries that we would like to seed in the city and see grow over time. So for us, it's very much about balancing the sort of financial logic that is bound up in the land and in the realities of the asset and in the market dynamics, along with those policy goals, which are local and regional and sometimes in conflict. And there's a lot of creativity that comes out of that conflict. It'll actually be a great time to show just two projects to give you a real feel for what I'm talking about. So just two projects I'll talk about. The first one is Essex Crossing. The public assets here are outlined in red. I know we're not supposed to put red around parcels. It's a callback to redlining, but I didn't make the slide. So these were former urban renewal lots. They were tenements that were condemned in the 50s, bulldozed, and then financing ran out. So they just sat empty as parking lots for 50 years. And as the market in the Lower East Side sort of improved, a planning process was set out with local stakeholders to try to figure out how can we bring these parcels back into the neighborhood fabric, how can we activate them, what can we develop on them that will contribute to not only the sort of lively Lower East Side market and neighborhood, but also have an element of restorative justice to them. There was a ethnically based taking here. How do we restore that and sort of overcome that with what is being developed in the future? So the Economic Development Corporation led an RFP process. We selected a joint venture between 3 different developers, a commercial developer, and then 2 developers who have experience in low-income housing or affordable housing and market rate development. And you can see on the next slide, which is a rendering. The next slide, most of these buildings are actually under construction now, if not completed. What was decided upon was a mixed-use development, 10 parcels, 10 phases, that includes senior affordable housing, regular affordable housing, some of the first office product that's been brought to this neighborhood, a movie theater, a grocery store, a public market that has affordable retail stalls for local retailers, and then market rate housing. Essex Crossing was very much driven by the planning process. People wanted this mix of uses. They didn't want it to just be affordable. They didn't want it to be just market rate. They didn't want it to be just housing. They wanted different kinds of entertainment and retail uses at different sizes for the community. So we were happy to make some concessions in the form of cash to the city. We didn't just sell off the parcels for the highest and best use for the most cash we could get. We reduced the land value in order to make sure that our development partners were able to actually deliver upon some of the affordability targets as well, not only in the housing, but also in the retail market. Another good example of a project that we undertook was, on the next slide, was the redevelopment of a Navy base in Staten Island. Staten Island is really interesting because, it is more suburban in character, I would say, than most of New York City. It is not so public transit oriented. People love their cars here, and we love that about Staten Islanders. And so when we were thinking about taking this closed off former Navy base, one of the goals that came out from the community process was we want to reconnect the neighborhood to the waterfront. But then also we wanted to create maybe a housing type that wasn't typical for Staten Islanders. And so not only are we building out an Esplanade, but we're also building out some of the first market rate housing in a multifamily apartment form in Staten Island. If you can see on the next slide, this is a product type that is very new for this part of Staten Island, and yet is reflective of the changing densities in Staten Island and changing user preferences. What's great about about the private partner that undertook this is they knew that this was a new product, and they knew they were really going to have to sell this to Staten Islanders who are used to living in sort of single family households. And so they focused on great architecture, great interior design, and high amenitization in order to say, hey, this is a compelling choice of lifestyle product. So in all these things, we try to think about what are the planning goals, openness, access, affordability, sustainability, both financially and environmentally, and then choose the private sector partner who's able to deliver upon that, and then negotiate a deal that financially enables them to do that.
I think you had said something in a previous call we had about, there are many things that we try at Tungsten to keep up with this stuff, but you definitely brought forth in our discussion some things that I had never actually thought about or encountered. But one of the things I think you were saying, you were doing like labor training that related to the construction in the community. I thought that was so cool. I hadn't actually even, really heard in the way you described it, but I thought that was really interesting if you could highlight that.
Sure, yeah, we have a whole list of different policy goals that we try to solve for. And one of them is how many local New York City folks can be involved in construction. And so we ask our development partners, can you hire from the community as much as possible? We have targets set up around MWBE, how many minority and women-owned businesses can be part of it. Typically our projects look to have at least 25% MWBE participation. Oftentimes there will be a preference for union shops. Union shops have certain regulations in place around worker training. So we usually feel that if we can have some union participation, there will be apprenticeship programs in place. We have an emerging developer fund. So to the extent that there's a smaller scale developer who wants to take the next step up, that's hard from a maybe capital stack perspective or just a regulatory sophistication perspective. We actually have a target around that to try to bring those smaller players to the next level. Job training is definitely the next sort of nut that we're trying to crack, trying to figure out how we can maybe more on the fly get local folks to be upskilled and involved. And hopefully I'll come back in a couple of years and talk about those programs more in depth.
I'm going to pass it over to Warren, but before I do, or to Aaron, sorry. But before I do, I just want to say, yeah, like, I mean, for those of you who don't know, I mean, a lot of those projects, I haven't gone to the Staten Island one, but I could say Essex Crossing is super impressive. You know, our office is in Soho, and I will personally walk like whatever that 10, 15 blocks to go get some of the food there in the food hall, which I think is like the most expensive food hall in the country or something. It's really in terms of build out, yeah, not in terms of price of your burger, but in terms of construction costs. It's a really impressive overall, you know, mixed use development, and I would encourage everyone to go check it out. And definitely a great job there.
I do like it.
So I want to pass it over to Aaron, and you also have a presentation, I think. So before I let Aaron take over the presentation, I just wanted to say again how happy we are to have him here, because placemaking is, in a sense, indescribable. We're trying to describe it. That's part of why we're here. I was able to speak on a panel 2 years ago at this program in person at Harvard, and you know, I kind of feel like people didn't even know what it was at the time. And I know for a lot of our projects, we'll discuss what we do, and we get the sense that the developers did not have what we do as a line item when they planned it, and that's fine. But we try to walk people through that, and I think and they're already aware of it, and everyone's doing it as much as they can, and it's growing. But what's interesting is Aaron has actually been tracking it through the numbers and through research as a research-based practice. And it's interesting to start to as it moves forward as a practice, to start to quantify and track it to see how it might be reflected in a more academic approach. So I'll pass it over to Aaron, and you can help to maybe describe what it is through your work.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so it's tricky to try to define how all this works, and I'll cover some slides in a minute. Thank you, Joe. It's difficult to truly pinpoint the value of placemaking, because as I mentioned earlier, it's somewhat individual, right? It's one's experience, it's one's interaction with a location. So how do you kind of piece that together? At the end of the day, what we've found, and when we use a number of different locations, and again, how one defines placemaking can vary. But when we look at vacancies, typically a nice mixed use project that is commanding a desire for people to go there. And I'm not talking just a grocery store and a pharmacy where everyone has to go anyway. It's you're choosing to go to these locations specifically. Those locations tend to have lower vacancy rates. They tend to have higher rental rates. And when you combine the two, that drives higher value, because at the end of the day, you have higher operating income from higher occupancies, higher rents, making those places more valuable to a developer. And the community also benefits as well, especially if you're doing it correctly and you're integrating what the community needs, whether that's affordable housing, whether that's schools, whether that's a theater, whatever it may be, to ultimately have that come together. I tend to focus on Boston, and there aren't a whole lot of big greenfield locations that you can just start from scratch. I mean, similar to what we're seeing in New York, right? I mean, you have to take all these different parcels and put them together to create a new opportunity for development. And these are well-established neighborhoods. These are well-established communities where people have an idea of what they want and what they need and what is lacking. So going back to that organic component, there's a piece here that you can't just take 4 blocks, put these 4 things there, and everything's magically happening. It can take some time. But I've got up on the screen here the Seaport in Boston. So I know that everyone's kind of spread across the country and across the globe here. But I wanted to kind of bring things a little closer to home. Had we been sitting over at Harvard's campus to go over this. But the Seaport is an area in Boston that has transformed. It's a new neighborhood, so to speak, but it's been there forever. This is a location that was originally shipping and transportation, where the goods really came into Greater Boston, into the city hundreds of years ago. It kind of went away. And part of that had to do with urban planning and the way that we operated, and we created highways that allowed people to come into Boston. And what it ended up doing is we created something called the Central Artery, which cut off Boston from its waterfront. So you can see on the sort of left-hand side of the screen here, there's a channel, or just past that into the actual downtown of Boston. There used to be an elevated highway that kind of cut this place off from the rest of the city. Well, the Big Dig took place, and there was a massive undertaking, and it combined with expanding our airport, it worked with cleaning up our harbor, ultimately created an opportunity for this entire area to thrive. And there's been multiple developers, multiple participants here, office, industrial, new life science, there's hotel, there's residential, for sale and for rent, retail. It's a new retail corridor in the city of Boston. It has really come together, and you can see all these different components here are pieces that are being added over time. And this is the pipeline, prior to everything that's gone on with COVID-19. We would expect the majority of these projects to continue to move forward as they were underway or close to being underway, have tenants in place. But it's changing the dynamic. And if you look along the map here, there's a Seaport Boulevard, Northern Avenue. That area has become the crux of the retail locations. So with retail there, you've got office, you have residential, hotel, a thriving area. And it's really come on in the last 10 years. Again, hard to believe in a city as old as Boston, formed in the 1600s, that you could have a new neighborhood. But I've got two kids, and my oldest is almost 11. We went into the city as a family for a meal. We're walking down Seaport Boulevard, and I could point out pretty much every single building there has been built since she was born. So this part of the neighborhood of the city is totally new. It's creating new competitive sets, and it's constantly changing. The retail's turning over a little bit as we're trying to find the right mix, and the different tenants that are moving. So it's new. Again, it's 10 years old, where the Back Bay, which we can get to a little bit later, is a very well-established neighborhood, which is, to me, the quintessential placemaking in the city of Boston. But that was not done by one group. That was done by numerous groups over decades and decades to make the Back Bay the location it is today. The Seaport is very, very early in that concept. I believe I've got another slide after Joe, if you don't mind switching. Thank you. So here are some of the emerging clusters in the area. All of these areas are seeing new development and new changes, and they're all going to be different. So I'm not going to go over each and every one of those. It's just not necessary. But the point is, placemaking in Alewife is different than placemaking in South Boston, which is different than Watertown. It's different than Dorchester or Somerville. All these neighborhoods and locations are different and require different needs and require different types of development, whether that's life science, whether that's regular office space, whether it's more housing, whether it's a combination. Ultimately, that's all gonna come together. So we're curious to see how that all changes and develops, but these are all within a very close location to one another, but they're very, very different when the built environment will ultimately be complete.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I think that the question of, you had mentioned that the word organic earlier in the conversation, and then I think that you also, both in conversations with me and here, kind of reflect this sort of, it wasn't planned ahead, but things sort of came together through different developers, working conjunction, maybe without necessarily planning for that. And some of the best places are created that way. And sometimes just adjacencies reflect and enhance that placemaking environment without it being part of a larger planned project from the beginning. As placemaking becomes, again, more of a buzzword and a thing and a practice that developers and cities are trying to put together, is there a risk of it becoming prescriptive? Is there a risk of it becoming formulaic? Is there a risk of things being a little bit more playing to placemaking and then maybe falling a bit flat? And if so, how can we sort of mitigate that? Does anyone want to try to answer that? Or if not, I can try to, or you guys can all jump in with whatever you want if that intrigues you as a question. But go ahead, Warren, maybe.
Sure.
Sure.
I was hoping you weren't going to call me first. No, I mean, I think, you know, sometimes we take these planning principles and we say, you know, we want it to be walkable and accessible and mixed use, and sort of just lose what that actually means and how that actually might work. You know, you can't take the same planning approach for every different neighborhood. I mean, I think for Staten Island, I go back to it because it's sort of so different from most of the contexts that we work in. You know, it's not that dense and it's not that transit oriented, and folks do enjoy genuinely driving their cars there. We can't take the same approach there that we would take anywhere else. You know, mixed use and walkable for Staten Islanders, you still need somewhere for them to park, right? Because that's how you're going to have it be accessible to them. So we need to think about that in our approach, and we can't just say sort of platitudes towards it. You know, similarly too, you can't solve for maybe one goal, which might be getting as much cash out of a project as you possibly can, and then stamp that it's a mixed use walkable project afterwards. For example, Hudson Yards, that was very much what they're trying to solve for. The MTA was trying to get as much bang for its buck off of its air rights as it could, and it did. However, that led to a development context characterized by these high density towers, which, you know, even though they're arrayed in a certain way with a sort of campus feel, didn't necessarily meet the test that a lot of folks going to the area felt was a real part of the neighborhood. So yeah, I think you can put the stamp on of placemaking, but not have it actually be that, and that's where it sort of falls apart. It has to be more organically defined, to Aaron's point earlier.
That was a really good answer, and thank you for helping me out on that, Warren. I want to pass up to Dishi, but before I do, because I want to see if maybe she can answer that. And then also I think Dishi may have it in slides, and the slides I know have so much green and pretty landscaping pictures that kind of do reflect on the question, because it involves a community being invited and brought in. Yeah, I mean, and just to quickly throw in a supplemental point to that, which I think is corresponding to what everyone's saying. For Tungsten, I think, you know, we've seen, I guess we've also advised maybe on some food halls over the years. There was one that the developer, you know, had the idea that you could just kind of put everything in place and just kind of set it back, and things are, they evolve, and so many tenants come and go, and it really needs to be infused with other things that aren't economic based. And I think that part of it is giving agency to and allowing independent proprietors to kind of have a stake in it and speak and have as much influence in that place as possible, but then also to involve, of course, the community and have programming and art and cultural aspects to it that will bring in the community, and then it sort of evolves over time. But the idea of pre-planning it very rigidly, I think, and I agree with you, Warren, it sometimes does fall flat, but I find that the more collaboration you have, the more responsibility, and the more you celebrate those who are helping you to make the place, and those hopefully being independent and from that city, and you're almost kind of incubating them and making them part of it. The more you give them a voice, I think the more the place evolves and has its own sort of way of speaking that evolves and will change over time. And I think that infusing that kind of dialogue between the different stakeholders, I think can be quite important to mitigating that rigidity that we spoke about. Dishi, I think you did have some slides. I want to make sure I didn't miss those. So I might ask you to kind of speak to that point, and maybe even throw in some of your slides, because you have some awesome stuff to show that you've been involved with.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely agree with you guys. And, you know, first, we always try to understand the place first, and we'll understand the nature of the place and we're creating, and sort of the experience that bringing to the place. And it's kind of like solving an urban problem, solving a problem altogether, project level and the place wise. So ultimately, we want to create this experience. So to address the need, first is the amenity. the safety-wise, lighting, how diverse use group, how people can all come to use this place. And really the place is, once it's made, and that really leads to all these experience, and people want a place that people come and enjoy and to play, and this sort of a core place that connected everybody. So yeah, certainly definitely seems a way something present certain, it seemed this way that about authenticity, but we always trying to avoid that and to create a space that really responding to the need of the area. Sure, there's a slide, some presence images is really, yeah, as you guys can see, these all, you all know where they are. And these are great examples around the country and even the world that different types of placemaking address green space, art and culture, like Michael just mentioned, and really these, you know, retail markets that different experience and people enjoy it and go to this place. It really draws attention that, and also respond pretty well to the nature and also the need in that specific area.
Those are definitely some prime examples that we've gone through. And again, you have your landscape architecture background. I think that the word biophilia comes in a lot now, which is coming inside the buildings as well. It's not just the parks outside, but you're seeing a more and more of an infusion of plants and sort of a form of interior landscape architecture that I think is improving the lives of the residents and occupants of those buildings and the community, to the extent that those buildings are shared spaces with the community, which so many lobbies are. Behind us, you see our amateur attempt at that at my home as we shelter in place here in New York City. Okay, moving on to Yepa. What's up, Yepa? So I'm gonna pass the mic over to Yepa in a second, but first off, I can't say enough how much I appreciate Yepa coming on. I literally called him, I think, yesterday or something, and you know, we got him in here, and Yepa, I think you and I had dinner like 2 months ago or something. It's been quite a different world since. Yepa is coming in from Berlin. So let me try to describe Yepa, and I think his bio is probably up there, so you should all check it out. But besides being a great guy, Yepa is an artist and a conceptual artist who I think ends up improving so many places through his sculptural installations, and he also does a lot of you know, gallery art as well. But I have seen his work has recently been at, you know, Brooklyn Bridge Park. I don't know if you guys have seen that in the audience, but it was a very I think impactful installation. He was also recently at Central Park in New York, the UN recently, I think related to climate change. I got a chance to see his work, which you'll see in a moment, at the Giardini in the most recent Venice Biennale. And also I wanted to note that I think in 2016, I visited his work in, was it World's End? World's End, which is outside of Boston, which you guys may have seen. I think we'll show some pictures. And that's maybe something that those of you, many of you are on the line now from Boston may have remembered. And really quick, I think that Yepa, yeah, his work, hey Yepa, his work to me, I think is, there's this minimalism to it. There's this super high degree of materiality and engineering, yet it's also super inviting to children and the community, and it's interactive and experiential, and as you'll see, I think it reflects his own vision of himself, and I just think it's really great work, and so important to the idea of placemaking, because it really is magnetic and draws people in and with the best intention. So I'll pass it off to Yepa. And I don't know.
So power of the art, I think, has been discussing at the moment recently on the internet, on the culture scene, because what art can do. Just imagine at the moment, if we have an art, if we have music, if we have books, if we have poets, no music, no film and things like that. All this time we're using for that is kind of getting us inspiration. And I think we need a lot of inspiration right now in our life, how to proceed the next level and get inspired by how to change ourselves in a way. And life, for me, is about art. I think my art is about communication and dialogue. So here you see Venice Biennale area, some benches. I'm working with the social aspect of benches. How do you use benches in the public space? How do you interact with each other? How do you play them? Where do you install them? Where do you want to have benches in your public spaces or in your private spaces around? It's very politically devised and a very political placement. Some different benches here, a funny build of one and me and one of an actor. It was a project with Public Art Fund in New York some years ago, where I installed it at Brooklyn Bridge Park, a very long, I think 10, 12 benches and other things. So what can benches do in the public space, and how can you make a line with the benches in a way to create dialogue? In New York, and I'm also working a lot with mirrors. What is mirror? Mirror is kind of reflecting the surrounding in you. It's somehow opening up you as a person. You look yourself, you're looking through the mirror, see other people, reflecting the surroundings. A small smile, I got a t-shirt on to say, a smile for you. A small smile can change a lot of things in the world, although it's for free, but we can give it much more out. So the mirror is somehow reflecting the surrounding. In the back loop, you see the financial district. That's why the mirrors here in Brooklyn Bridge Park are at different heights. You can see it was like 3 rings of mirrors you can go into. Here's the piece from Boston. Very, very beautiful location out in the nature. So it's actually just reflecting the nature, different heights, another circle. And stars and night, just to see how much they adopt. And snow, a very big installation. I did work with mirrors and water in Norway, in Kistefoss, on a very big sculpture park. Actually, this piece was installed some years ago, and normally they have 25,000 visitors at this sculpture park. And that moment, that year, they had 60,000 people. That's increased, that the restaurant has to make double size and double much food. The park place has to change. So like an art piece, and it's actually stayed at right now. Bjarke Ingels just made a very big famous building called the Twist over the Elbe, just right behind us. Just to show you how I work with mirrors, but also again water. Water is the dragging material which I'm working a lot with. Here is like increased from the water from the Elbe, from the river. But again, water is how to say, a material which is dragging us in. But I'm using it for like architecture. So this is in Stockholm on a square. So it's like, it's interactive, different rooms, the water go down, you can go into the water, you're surrounded by water, you have people coming into you, some people springing, jumping directly through. Here you have a square, which I did recently in December in West Palm, a little bit north of Miami, and I got invited to do the square and the whole square of monument, of the design of the stone as well. And then when you start the water, you see again, it's increasing the whole square, the restaurants, the real estate, everything around is flowering because there is so much attention. Everyone is coming there and being part of that. And this was just at night, but it's with light on, so you see somehow what water and of course art can do in a collaboration with landscape and of course different business. Then I do some balloons, and there was just a photo of a funny guy, which some of you maybe know. And so I do some balloons which are hanging. Sometimes they're hanging in the ceiling. Here this was an art fair. I didn't have another better image at the moment, but I'm installing it right now. I'm working right now on a project in Copenhagen on a small metro station where since years they hang 2 balloons, and now I'm installing 10 more. So somehow increasing, you can be hanging in the foyer or at the home, and they are moving a little bit if there's coming a wind, but they're not falling down, of course, but they have different situations. I'm working a lot with mirror, as I said, and here the 303 gallery is called Sun and Moon. It's like 3 meters big, it's very big, it's like perforated stainless steel. There's a light behind, and it's creating the reflection, inviting the public and the viewer into themselves, and the whole, I would say, the whole mirror changing very slowly. And on the other side, there's another one. So there's one, this is the moon, with a bluish color, and you see the reflection on the floor, but it's somehow adopting the whole space and the surrounding, especially the audience. Some project I'm working on for next year, which is coming up. This is like a project for Denmark. I'm working with like wayfinding. This is the train station and a bus station, and you have to go like a couple of kilometers, 20 minutes to go to the museum. So I have made these 30 lamps of a little bit like crazy lightning in a way to follow. So you can see the light coming to the bus station, and you go and you know where to go. So you're finding, you see where the lights are, and you're going towards through different, I would say, social housing, I would say, and you're finding a way to come to the museum. I'm installing this one very soon, up very high in the north. It's called Lofoten. It's in Norway, and it's like almost up at the highest point in Norway. It's a very beautiful place, and it's a small city, and they really like to have a marking for the city and for the tourism. The most more tourists is coming by, and this is the piece called Eye of the North, and it's like a perforated mirror. It's concave and convex, so it's also on the backside mirror, and you can go up and you can look out and you will see the in the mirror, of course, at the stars, and you will see the northern lights in winter. Then I'm talking very fast, but then here there's a project which we're also working right now on. If you look on the top of the building to the right, which is made from Kobe Architect from Denmark. This is in Denmark. It's a very big steel ball. And this is somehow, there's underneath, there's a metro station, and there's a food court, and there is some, really like some apartments. And on top of that ball, it's a very big, bigger than I, mirror ball, and it's moving very slowly. So it's balancing, it's called balance of time. And it's a little bit like showing where are we right now in this kind of time. We're balancing through of the world right now, trying to find or to grab on something. And I think we need to rethink a lot of things. And I know that a lot of people are suffering, but a lot of things also flowering. Right now is spring. And I think will change and grow, and we will all find a solution, although we need to find new paths. And this ball is then driving very slowly on top of this, I would say, platform on top of the apartment. And in 1 hour, it's driving around the whole building. So at 12, it's starting on the middle of the corner. And actually downstairs, there's a subway station called the Circle Line. And it's also, I think it's also driving in a circle. So it's kind of an idea that this driving underneath under the earth in Copenhagen, and this one will drive on top of a building. And if after 30 minutes, it will be on the other side, then the people living on the courtyard on the other side, they will be able to see the piece as well. So it's not just for the people outside, the building is also people inside the building. So in general, I get invitation, I work with a lot of people, I work with Public Art Fund for some commissions, which I'm not allowed to talk about, but you will very soon see something very big in New York, which we have been announced already. And I'm very excited about it. We're installing right now in the airport of LaGuardia. But we are working a lot with inviting with architects, big architects, for instance, or Coop Architect and Koolhaas and stuff like that. Like architects invite me to try to sometimes to solve a problem, which was this one. This one was actually the architect came after that, and the mayor said, normally we have towers of the building. What do we bring up there? And they was like, what are we doing? And they asked me somehow to get an idea. And sometimes we work really closely, and sometimes we're opening up like for a square, for museum, for galleries. So it's very, very different how we work. I have a studio, 25 people helping me to combine that. We have a yoga, we have a cook, cooking every day, but not at the moment, unfortunately. Now we have somehow house. So I'm doing these mirror boxes. As you can see, it's a mirror box. You look inside of the mirror, I have a neon text in it. That was also, I do a lot of my own process of the world. So I'm not trying to teach any one of you something at all, but of course I try to inspire you. Art is about inspiration. So if I can't change the world, which I think I can with the art we're doing, but then I have to change myself. And in the process, the last 10 years, where I had complicating situation with too much work, blah, 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 so I needed to go inwards, I found out that this is what I can do. I can change myself.
Yeah, but I mean, that's great. And I was going to ask you a question about that. As you were talking and showing those pieces, I was thinking about how artists, especially sculptors who present larger works, are often there's a message there. I don't have the quote, but I remember reading somewhere that Rothko, and by the way, the Rothko Chapel is another amazing example of public art. But I remember him saying something like, "I want my artwork to be in front of someone at the dinner table and make them feel uncomfortable. I want it to be almost like imposing." And I think about, Jeff Koons, and I think it's the tulips that he sort of donated to France, and he had an intention there, and that created a lot of dialogue and about, I think that was with respect to the Bataclan, and there's just like often a message behind what the artist is saying, and I think that what the artist is producing. And I guess, you are very open about your own personal kind of journey, and I'm wondering how that's, just as a quick question, you kind of alluded to it, but how it's reflected in the art. So you have these minimalist mirror sculptures, which again, I think the paradox is that they are sort of rigid minimalists, high grade steel, but then they become this sort of hospitality enterprise. So how does that reflect, as a final question to you? And I do want to get to the COVID things. A lot of people are chatting that up, so I'm gonna get right to that. But how does sort of your story reflect itself somehow in the message that you're putting forth in your work? Maybe you've already said it, but maybe I can ask.
Art, I think in all kind of art, we are trying all to tell stories or tell something and try to inspire the world with something. And I think that one of the big inspirations you can get is actually to go inwards, but also to look in yourself, to look in the mirror, to see who you are, because a lot of the people we are in the world, we don't know who we are. So if you start to, that's the first thing, we have to love ourselves, otherwise you can't love someone else. And this is what I'm working a lot on. But I think that reflecting, for instance, is reflecting, like it's just a word, but reflecting also the surroundings. And how do you interact with the surrounding in your life? And I think that what I said before, a smile can do a big change. And in my opinion and in my life, I needed to rethink in a way, the way I was doing my art, the way I was like looking at people and blaming people and blaming my wife or my kids or whatever, but finding out that I can't blame anyone else. And the art is kind of a tool for that. The art is kind of a tool for me to communicate my feelings, of course, also, and also trying to inspire the world to breathe, like the Breathe With Me project in Central Park at the United Nations headquarters, but also just to experience a bench to sit there. And so this is quite a funny to see this very strange space, and certainly someone coming next to you. And because the bench is going like this, you slide together and you're sitting very close to each other, which is of course very strange because of this interactivity. So I think art can connect us. Art can change situations, which it does. When art is, I would say, going into a dialogue, directly dialogue, it's not all art, I think, can do that. But if you're working, I think, with interactivity, which I'm very, very, very interested in how you interact with the art. But if you work with that, it can change areas, it can change buildings, it can change atmospheres, and it can change cities. I have water pavilions in different cities, which the city changed in a dynamic of, I would almost say, love, because I think that we need to create more empathy and love in the world. And I think this is what art can also do.
So on that note,
actually, Michael, could I just sort of jump in? I really appreciate seeing Jeppe's work, because I think it brings a different scale to the placemaking conversation than something that I'm able to bring. When I think about placemaking, I think about those broad policy and sort of social goals and how to create the scaffolding for that with our private sector partners. We think, does this neighborhood lack public space? Does it lack affordable housing? Does it lack commercial space? And that's sort of just one scale. It's the neighborhood or maybe city scale. But then we want to create that scaffolding so artists like Jeppe can actually have a venue to put some of that art in there, or maybe the local retailers can bring their sort of unique flavor to the wares that they're selling, because that's all more of the placemaking story. That's maybe more on the everyday of the experience. So I really appreciate having sort of Jeppe's work in there. That's all sort of on the same goal of placemaking, but different scales. And it's really interesting to see how it plays out.
And it's a differentiator within the space, right? It creates that reason to go and to experience and to be part of something. It's not just a building. It's a much deeper experience.
And if I can just jump in with, kind of a wild card here, or frankly, the most pervasive question, the true elephant in the room, and also the subject of so many chats coming into the right of my screen. Jeppe spoke about, literally people being forced together on a bench and, congregation. And of course, look where we are, right? So look where I am. I don't think I've left my apartment other than to take the garbage out for like 25 days. I mean, it's pretty crazy here in New York. I'm sure others are dialing in from New York. And this is a really interesting time. In some ways, as horrible as it is, it's also kind of a beautiful time. And some of the nicest things that I've had in recent it will probably be memories for a very long time that were some very simple moments that have been looked at a different way through all this. But my question, I guess, to y'all is, how is placemaking going to be affected by this? How is it immediately affected by it? How is it going to be affected in the future? I've heard, we've been speaking to so many people who we work with, and I've heard some people say, like, no one's ever going to touch a menu again, someone who owns a restaurant group. I've heard other people much more optimistic. I personally would like to keep some optimism, and I'd like to think that when this is all over, there's some level of exuberance and just kind of like an exploding sense of optimism, if it can be truly defined as over in the near future. But I'll put it to you all, like, what do you think is going on with placemaking in light of the COVID-19 experience? And remember, all of you chatting, we will open it up to questions, so we'd love to hear from you. But go ahead, anyone who wants to jump in, or I figure I'd throw it out to you. Anybody? Warren?
Sure.
Whoever was speaking, Dishi, go for it. Sorry.
Sure, I'll just jump in. Yeah, it's a really, it's an unusual time that, just a few weeks ago, we were still having events, the open space, the venues, and now we're distancing. So it certainly is it's first time for everybody to experience, but I think it is a time to really be creative and innovative, to think about the place, and especially addressing some of the key areas like public health. And so from a design standpoint, I see that, we might be thinking about the design of the width of the path, or sometimes the materials. This is just, from reading that COVID might exist as certain materials longer than some other surface, and metal versus plastic. So that might make me think what we can apply this towards the future design. So I think this is challenging, but also in a way that gave us opportunity to think future design, both long-term and short-term. There's gonna be a tremendous recovery need after waste saving, the immediate life and need. So in terms of all, I see that therapeutic garden, healing gardens are popping up, and after all these. So I think it's an opportunity also implementing a lot of new ideas and elements into making this place, and is truly important. I think I see is urgent as well to address.
That's really good. Aaron, did you have anything that you wanted to add there? Just to make sure.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. At the end of the day, this disruption is unlike anything any of us have ever experienced. And we need to look at history in order to get a sense of what happened in past pandemics that have caused the disruption, the loss of life that we're seeing today on a global scale. I'm highly confident that we will find a solution to keeping people safe. And whether that's new therapies, new drugs, vaccines, there's a number of them in the works. I'm highly confident that whether it comes from Boston or New York or China or Germany or wherever across the globe, we're going to find opportunities to keep people safe. And we're going to get back to a more normal life. Yes, we're all at home, we're all sort of cooped up, and that's creating its own unique challenges. But getting back out, people are desperate to do that, especially those in the Northeast who have been in a more restrictive stay-at-home, shelter-in-place type of situation. At least here in the United States, across the globe, obviously same kind of situations. But people are going to go to parks. People are going to go to the mall. People are going to go back to their office buildings. They're going to go and stay at hotels. Now, there will be a small portion of the population that will avoid crowds. They will avoid people. And that's completely understandable. But if you think of other past crises, we do get back to a sense of normalcy. It may take some time, but I think in the world of real estate, and some of the questions that I saw there about going to a park, going to a public space, interacting, there will be kids at the beach. There'll be kids at the pool. There'll be people in close proximity, not just staying 6 feet apart forever. We might have a heightened awareness. People will wash their hands more. We'll probably have some additional things built into buildings, whether that's hand washing stations or ways to sanitize your hands with hand sanitizer, things of that nature, just becoming sort of part of our everyday. But at the end of the day, my firm belief is that we're going to get back to similar to what we were doing just a few months ago.
Yeah, I share Aaron's optimism. I think right now we are really realizing how much we love the amenities that we have, both in our apartment buildings and just from the surrounding neighborhood, from the parks to the retail. There's two trends that we've been seeing in real estate development among the private developers I work with, and that's interior and exterior flexibility. So from a floor plate perspective, people want large columnless open floor plates, high floor to ceiling windows, because it's a very flexible interior that they can lay out and program very specifically for each of their specific tenants. And then similarly with open spaces, they don't want the city being overly prescriptive in the public design mandate for any privately owned public space. They want to be able to curate different programs, be that pop-up markets, maybe arts installations like epes over time. And I think that flexibility has been very key during this crisis to saying, how can we redeploy both our, our parks and our different properties to respond to this. So maybe you're using, and this is a very real example, maybe you're using an unfinished floor and fitting it out with COVID response beds. Or maybe you're using a parking lot or a private open space that can be deprogrammed, and you're putting up a pop-up drive-through testing center. So I think keeping flexibility in mind in design, and then also in our contractual relationships with developers, will be an important lesson, because those flexible spaces have been the ones that have been able to most respond to this crisis.
I mean, I guess, there's people involved in this panel who are planning and, from a government level, a developer level, an art level, analytical level, and hopefully this whole thing at least creates a level of deeper sensitivity and thoughtfulness towards how we interact in a general sense going forward. And I mean, that's reflected from a safety perspective, but also just from, hopefully just caring and being more sensitive in general to how we interact with each other and through these developments that we're creating. So I wanted to ask one more question, wildcard, which no one has to answer. But what would you all feel would be one of your best examples of placemaking? It could be super small, super big, could be from a movie, I don't know. Go ahead, I'll kind of go right down on my screen, the Hollywood Squares there. I'll throw that out to Warren.
Sure, I gotta say Brooklyn Bridge Park, I think it's a great public-private development. It balances financial sustainability, so keeping development parcels available for sale to the private sector, with public access and amenities, so also keeping space for parklands. There's intense pressure to either privatize the whole thing or make it all park space, and I think they found a really great balance.
Awesome. Aaron?
I kind of alluded to this earlier, but I'm firmly in the belief that the Back Bay in Boston is the best example of mixed use and placemaking that I've seen, at least around Greater Boston. You have park space, you have choice retail, awesome neighborhoods, great restaurants, experiential opportunities throughout the entire neighborhood, and it's taken a long time to get to that, and it's been components added on over time. It was not a singular put this here and everything happened. It was development after development, change after change, different mayors' goals and drives to ultimately create what happened here. And ultimately it came down to the people. Residential neighborhood that expanded into what it is today, which is really Boston's only 24-hour neighborhood.
And I agree with you, Aaron. I think that the people are ultimately, in a way, that the decision on whether or not it's successful from a placemaking perspective, and they catalyze it. Dishi, I don't see you there, but do you want to jump in? I think you're there somewhere.
Yeah, certainly. So I was dropping out for a second, couldn't connect Could you repeat the question, Michael?
Yeah, no, and I actually froze too, so that happened. So sorry about that, everybody. But yeah, Dishi, sorry, I was asking, and sorry to put you on the spot now, but what do you feel is sort of your best example that you've seen anywhere or never even happened of placemaking?
Yeah, certainly. Wow, there's so many great examples. Like when I was even thinking, just putting up the images I was showing you guys earlier is also a very different type of placemaking from all over the world. And I think great examples from well, you know, where we learn experience, some great examples like Baltimore Inner Harbor that created sort of earlier placemaking environment that really connect people, address the waterfront, and also the retail experience, very cohesive design. And then until you know, Santana Row, these type of heavy retail experience that really bring people together, create a central urban core place. That's also type of placemaking. And I live in Washington, D.C. We see the new placemaking examples like the Wharf, the Navy Yard. These all really the address the amenities and also the experience that people truly really want to can spend a day and then for multiple uses.
Thank you, Dishi. And Yepa, did you want to take a shot at it?
I just share you one. I think the second biggest city in Denmark called Aarhus, and just very fast share here, and I'll show you this one. It's a very big called the Rainbow. I can't remember the full title, but it's a big museum, second biggest museum in Denmark called Aarhus. And Olafur Eliasson, a colleague from mine, a very good artist, he made the big waterfalls in New York with Public Art Fund some years ago back. He created this art piece there, which is you go up to it and go into it. You can go around, and it's like a 360 degrees rainbow. And of course, that creates kind of course, enormous interest. So people are traveling from around the world to come to the city, to come to this museum, to experience that art piece. And of course, I know this is not the whole city and the whole development in a way, but of course, it is an act that when you're placing an artwork, it has a certain kind of size, I would say, and also size, and very important, I think, are very social minded. That means you can be a part of it, you can feel it, you can feel it on your body. I think then it's very strong and can be very, very well related to the city, and everyone comes and see that.
Yeah, I agree with you. That's an amazing one. And if I were going to throw it out there, and I'll see if I can share the screen too. I have no idea. So I'll try to be quick, but Marfa is certainly not a commercial enterprise placemaking from a developer in any sense. Marfa is a city with, I think, 2,000 person population in the high desert of Texas, the beautiful landscape of the high desert of Texas. Donald Judd, decades ago, came there and set up an arts institution, Chinati, in a military base, and he created these amazing minimalist works that are, frankly, some of the most arresting examples of minimalist artwork I've ever seen in my life. And Tungsten's been very blessed to be able to do some work in Marfa over the years and visit there. I like to visit there as much as I can. But what's interesting about it to me, these are John Chamberlain, some other artists he had collaborated with, Dan Flavin. But what's interesting to me about it is that it started, I mean, the history of the town had been, obviously, it was a very interesting town, and shout out to everybody from Marfa who may be listening. But Judd brought something that was really an incredible degree of art installed there, and he had already found a success in New York, but his art was very reflective of the landscape and really, I think, is in dialogue with it and channels the landscape, and also reflected even the history and the architecture. He altered the buildings within the military base to be congruent with the art. And I guess the point is that by infusing a town of a very small population with a huge amount of art and thoughtfulness and collaboration and content, it has put that very small town globally on the map. People will fly in from Europe and drive 4 hours. I think the nearest airport is so far away. So I just think it's interesting to show how something that's done thoughtfully, again, Donald Judd was not trying to be, he's just an amazing artist and conceptual artist, but maybe indirectly, he did create a place that is such a destination. And I just think it really resonates with us, the way that was articulated through Judd, and still super enduring and even growing in a way to this day. So I'll stop. Okay, we are going to try to throw it out to the group for questions. I'm going to rely on our trusted hosts from Harvard Graduate School Design, Grace and Joe. I think you're supposed to kind of help us answer the questions, or do you want to jump in? Ooh, if you guys didn't hear me.
So we're having a lot of really exciting conversations going on in the group chat. So maybe we can start with a question from Anna Goga. Anna, do you want to ask your question?
Sure, I had a couple of them. Which one would you like to start with?
Maybe the one on differentiating placemaking and making a public space.
Yeah, sure. So I had a question about difference between making a public space and placemaking, because for me, placemaking is more about preserving the current culture. And I think it is more about making very modest interventions, sort of surgical ones, which preserves the space as it is, but not creating a lot of different like action interventions. While I think creating a public space means creating an actual events and like sort of places, like benches and different interventions. And I just wanted to ask, what do you think about that difference between them?
Maybe I can speak to this, at least in the city context. No, I think it's most easily illustrated with public space, but some of the city's goals include revitalizing commercial districts or converting a former manufacturing district into maybe a residential area. Something where the former place or the existing place is no longer serving the community's needs. A very good, if controversial, example would be Hudson Yards. It was a rail yard. There was nothing there beforehand. And so there was a deck built over it and then a new commercial district. And very much the goal was to create a new commercial node in Midtown Manhattan. And so there isn't a lot of public space there because the primary goal was, both getting money for the asset, the MTA, the Transit Authority, and also building new commercial towers. So one of the criticisms of it is it's not a great public space. That also wasn't necessarily the goal. So as the city, as a developer, we think about different types of uses that are missing in a neighborhood. And it's not always public space oriented.
Great, thank you, Warren. Another question, Grace or Joe?
Yes, I think there's another wonderful question from Don't Plan For Us Without Us. What about placekeeping? The neighborhoods have been great well before planners and developers wants to create high-end and best use. Who wants to take that?
I mean that's certainly true, and that's exactly why you need a public component to development and to change. The example there of the old manufacturing district that's no longer serving the neighborhood and serving the needs of residents, converting that into something new, whether that's new types of businesses or whether that's residential, I think it's a great example of that. But understanding the scale and what the community needs, what the community feels it's lacking, allows for better, more comprehensive development. And sometimes there's a give and take there. A developer at the end of the day is not a nonprofit organization. They're looking to maximize return. So in most situations, bigger, better, bigger, turns into a better return. But sometimes you can rescale that and you can redesign it and you can work with the community. And architects are so important to this piece, right? In that their way of design and in a way creating a building as art to mix with the neighborhood, either tying in with the same feel of the neighborhood, expanding upon it, or allowing for different interaction with the space.
Yeah, and I to that, so certainly second that too, because when we think about new development, we want to design something that can last, 5 to 10 years, and even, revolving as a process experience. So it certainly leads to this experience and draw people to come to this place. So sometimes we can change the massing or the the space physically, but there are always opportunity to think what to bring to the space and as ongoing. So for example, there's seasonal events are happening throughout the year, there are decorations throughout the year. So certainly that's responding well each other. So that's always we keep in mind when the place make it flexible to adjustable to cohesively like, as a whole in the development.
Anybody else? Or
I would say, you know, what a place is really varies to the different stakeholders that you talk to. You know, some people, you know, if you're an artist colony inhabiting that sort of manufacturing district, that might be perfect for you. If you are moving to the city or there's a need for greater affordable housing units, you might want to see those manufacturing warehouses put to use for you. So I think part of my job is balancing all of those tensions, and not every stakeholder group is sort of going to have their needs met. We try to compromise, but placemaking is converting from one place to another and changing the identity. So, and sometimes for good reasons from a city perspective, but not great reasons from a maybe local neighborhood context perspective. We try to get it right, but we don't always.
yeah, and I'll speak to that a little bit. So we even mentioned the Hudson Square partnership, and what's interesting, many things are interesting about that partnership, but one of them is, so again, it's Hines, which is this really amazing international developer in partnership with Norges, which is the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, I believe, out of Norway, and then Trinity, and I hope there's some Trinity people on the line, but Trinity Church has been around for centuries. I think they predate the United States. So they own the land and have for centuries, and they take a really, really long view of that community at Hudson Square. And so much of our work has been always keeping in mind how everything we do, from the architecture to the procurement of different collaborators and tenants art, is reflective of the community to hopefully keep them in the conversation as a stakeholder. Similarly, Brookfield, which again, Tungsten is lucky enough to work with out in San Francisco on two big projects. And I'll put up, on Tungsten Partners, we put up a little URL, Harvard RE 2020, so you can see some of these things if you want to check them out. The Pier 70 project is in Dogpatch, which is an incredibly creative neighborhood that has so many makers, and it's been a really important part of San Francisco. And this former industrial development is repositioning these amazing buildings that used to be battleship shipyards. And so there's just so much work that Brookfield had done and so much that we had done to help to try to keep that manufacturing aspect still in the community, and that there's economic incentives for that, where rents are put at a certain level, and TI, this is tenant improvements, are put at a certain level to support those manufacturing tenants to stay and to come and work there, and thus through a transparency with the public to come in and watch them do what they do and actually produce for the community. So I think that the idea of placekeeping is a word I'm going to take from whoever that was who going forward. I think it's a great word that I hadn't heard before. And yeah, I think it's super important because in conclusion, people can kind of sniff out authenticity and intent. And if you don't do it in an honest intention to really care for those whose neighborhood it was before, I think it's really easy to see through that. And I think you really have to try to do your best to engage and have that dialogue and reflect it because people can see through it if you don't. So guys, what do you think? Grace and Joe, do we have more time? Should we wrap it up? I see a question coming in from Hallmark.
Yeah.
What do y'all think? I'll leave it in your hands.
I think we have more time for that. And I think a question from Scott and Dee can somewhat be combined, because I remember you talked about how we should think placemaking through the lens of digital era. So I think Scott can go first, and then Dee about the AR and VR technology.
Great question, by the way.
Yep.
Thank you. Go ahead, Scott, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, hey everyone.
Hey, Scott.
So I'm kind of thinking of it from a more neighborhood perspective, and Michael, you're familiar with Ossington and the Ossington project that we're working on, and the BIA there has, we work closely with, and we're talking about kind of initiatives to support the businesses and tenants within the neighborhood. And one thing that we're talking about is, you know, with us as a developer, we have projects under construction right now, but we also have these constant conversations with tenants about the current situation. So we're discussing, you know, what does that look like from a placemaking perspective on the digital side, which kind of complements the developments in project as well as working with the tenants on that. So I wonder what everyone thinks on that.
Great question, Scott. Anyone want to take it?
Well, so many, especially today, digital is very important in order to communicate a brand, communicate a design, communicate really any kind of message. And I think a lot, this giant social experiment that we're operating under is forcing technology in the hands of a lot more people than probably was happening just a couple months ago. So really understanding how to utilize digital, how to combine that with a project within a development, within a neighborhood, makes a difference. And we've seen it on both sides where you've got a sort of a campaign, if you will, on a new development, a new community plan, and then you might have others in the community who feel differently, and they've got their own sort of digital campaign going on there, and whether that's Twitter, whether that's Facebook, YouTube, any of the different social media opportunities, or AR, VR, something online will make a difference. You know, the AR, VR stuff is very different in terms of the development itself and trying to help people experience something that doesn't exist, particularly in an area that is, let's say, an old manufacturing site, the old Navy base, the old was something, but it isn't anymore. It's hard for a lot of people to truly understand what something will be when you look at a rendering, when you see a pretty picture, but to walk in and look around and actually try to experience and see what it's going to look like, go down the hallway, go to where the elevator bank is, go where the restaurant is, go with whatever it might be, sets the things apart and makes a huge difference. And we're seeing that really resonate with decision makers today.
Yeah, well, I'll just say one quick thing there. We're working with a group right now. They're called Walk Through It. And as we're talking to brokers and on more of the leasing side of it right now, it's exactly that, is these buildings that are under construction, how do we, you know, facilitate tours or just kind of have information about these places? And this group that we're working with has actually mocked what the unit's going to look like as a tech office, as a designer, as like a fashion retail store, whatever that might be for a couple of the projects. So yeah, that's kind of how we're trying to push that forward on our end. Yeah.
And it's becoming far more commonplace in the world of brokerage and leasing, and helping to show folks what the world is. And in our experience with working with tenants, even if you take an existing office building and you're showing them a floor and there's a bunch of furniture there, there's already the pre-existing operations, it can be difficult for that group to understand how they could use that space, especially if the design is not what they see as their own brand, their own use. So having any kind of tool to showcase what it could be, what it should be, particularly anything interactive where you can move things around and start to see how you could lay out your own office and design and kitchen space and an open space, whatever it is for each company, makes a big difference.
So anyone else have an answer to that question? If I could jump into, yeah, I mean, I might just say that, I mean, there's a lot of answers to that question, but one thing I think is interesting is that things that are the most analog, the most non-digital, are super relevant to digital. And I mean that in the sense that I think that the advent or the ubiquitous nature of digital transmission through social media and the web has caused sort of a higher level of standard of what people expect to find within their communities and what they expect to see, meaning better produced goods, more authentic, independent restaurants, coffee shops, more content. I think that the best things tend to be attracted and transmitted and celebrated online. And then more people will then find those things and come from a wider radius, concentric circle, to go and find those things, even internationally at some point. That's a lot of what Tungsten does. We try to find things that are sort of best in class and super creative and sometimes incredibly small. I mean, I think one of the best pastry chefs I know is in Dumbo. It's called Burrow, and you barely even find it, but it's amazing. She's an amazing pastry chef. And so those things are transmitted online, and then the online sort of allows for a higher standard to occur. And then I think it gets transmitted, and that's the new effect. It kind of raised the bar a bit. Any other points? But I think that's going to be about it. And by the way, Scott and the Hallmark guys, so shout out to Toronto and Hallmark and Jeff and the crew. But we'll try to put some of that on our website, the Thompson Partners website, and I'll put it into the chat after this. To make sure I can direct people to Hallmark and other people that come up in this. If anyone has any collaborators or anybody here, and also the Harvard group will help with that, I think, too. Grace, Joe, anything else before we wrap it up? I think we're 10 minutes over, but that's okay.
Yep.
No? Good. Thumbs up. Is that a thumbs up? Okay. So I think we're going to wrap it up. Thank you so much, Grace, Joe, Warren, Dishi, Aaron, Yepa, all of you at home and wherever you are, be safe. Thank you so much for collaborating. That went really well, and I'm so grateful. Yeah, thank you. So yeah, it's been super awesome, and look online. I'll chat through that URL.
I think we may have lost Michael, but
Yeah.
thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Awesome job, everyone on the panel, and thank you for the questions. Sorry we couldn't get to every single one of them, but feel free to reach out to us after the fact.
We'll
Thank you.
follow up with a link to the recording, as well as potentially a way for people to connect with panelists if you didn't get to ask your question today.
Yes. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, Michael's
Bye,
back.
everybody. Yeah, Bar, I don't know if you could hear that, but bye, everybody. Thank you.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.